have you ever noticed that the people who disappear rarely announce they're leaving? There isn't a final argument, no dramatic goodbye, no message that says, "I'm cutting everyone off." Instead, they simply become harder to find. The friend who always replied within minutes now answers days later. The person who never missed a gathering suddenly prefers staying home. The conversations become shorter, the silence becomes longer, and eventually, someone says the sentence they always do: "You've changed." Maybe they're right, but not in the way they think, because intelligent people don't wake up one morning and suddenly decide they no longer need anyone. The distance begins much earlier, long before anyone else can see it. It begins with a realization so quiet that even they mistake it for exhaustion. Imagine you're sitting in a room full of people you've known for years. Everyone is laughing. Someone tells a familiar story. Someone tells a fee. Another person complains about work. Someone else scrolls through their phone while pretending to listen. Nothing unusual is happening, yet somehow you feel like you've already lived this moment. Not once, 100 times. You already know who will interrupt. You know who will turn the conversation back to themselves. You know who will agree with every opinion in the room, only to say something completely different after they leave. The strange part isn't that people become predictable. It's that your mind suddenly realizes they always were. Psychologists call this pattern recognition. Those two words hardly capture what it actually feels like, because it doesn't feel like learning something new. It feels like waking up inside a life you've been sleepwalking through. And once you're awake, it's impossible to dream the same dream again. Here's the first truth. Almost nobody tells you awareness is expensive. The more clearly you see, the harder it becomes to pretend you don't. You notice the friend who only remembers your birthday after forgetting theirs. The coworker who praises your ideas during meetings, but quietly claims them later. The family member who says, "I'm just being honest," when what they really mean is, "I don't want to question the way I treat you." None of these moments seem important on their own. That's why most people ignore them. But your mind doesn't collect moments anymore. It collects patterns. And patterns tell stories that individual moments never can. One day, you stop asking, "Why did they do that?" Instead, another question quietly appears. "How long has this been happening without me noticing?" That question changes something deep inside you, because suddenly, you're no longer grieving one disappointing conversation. You're grieving the illusion you had about the relationship itself. Most people think intelligence is about solving difficult problems. It isn't. Sometimes, it's the inability to ignore the obvious ones. That's why highly self-aware people often look tired, not because life is heavier, because they keep carrying truths they can no longer unsee. Psychologists have long suggested that our minds are built to protect consistency. We would rather believe a comforting story, than question someone we've trusted for years, with have a going popular too. That's why red flags often look pink when they're attached to someone we love, until one day they don't. One realization becomes two become 10, and suddenly, you're looking at the same people through completely different eyes. Not because they've changed, Dury said, because your excuses finally have. Here's where most people misunderstand what happens next. They assume intelligent people become distant because they think they're better than everyone else. But what if the opposite is true? What if they step back because they're no longer sure where they truly belong? Think about the last conversation that left you feeling strangely empty. Nothing bad happened. Nobody insulted you. You even smiled. Yet on the drive home, one question refused to leave your mind. Why do I feel lonelier after spending time with people? That's a dangerous question, because once you ask it, honestly, your life quietly begins dividing itself into two worlds. The places where you feel connected, and the places where you've only been pretending. Most people spend years trying to fit into every room they enter. Intelligent people eventually begin asking something far more uncomfortable. What if some rooms were never meant for me? That isn't arrogance. It's the beginning of discernment. And discernment has a strange side effect. It doesn't just change The way you see other people, it quietly changes. The way you see yourself, because the hardest pattern you'll ever recognize isn't hidden inside someone else's behavior. How's work, behavior, it's hidden inside your own. And once you see that, disappearing from other people's lives becomes the least interesting part of the story. It becomes the beginning of finally meeting the person you've been trying so hard to avoid. Most people believe disappearing begins with a decision. It doesn't. It begins with a feeling that's almost impossible to explain to someone who's never experienced it. Imagine opening your phone after a long day. The screen lights up, messages, notifications, group chats, filled with conversations you haven't answered. For a moment, you just stare at them. You just stare at them, not because you're busy, not because you're angry, but because, somehow, every reply feels like another performance. You start typing, then you delete it. You type again, delete it. Finally, you lock your phone and place it face down, not out of disrespect, out of exhaustion. And that's the moment most people misunderstand. They think you've stopped caring. The truth is, you're simply tired of speaking from a version of yourself that no longer feels real. Here's something psychologists rarely say out loud. The mind doesn't become exhausted because it thinks too much. It becomes exhausted because it carries too many versions of itself. There's the version your family expects, the version your friends know, the version you become at work, and the version you perform because you don't want to disappoint anyone. For years, you move between them without even noticing, changing your words, changing your opinions, even changing your laughter. Mostly, until one quiet afternoon, a strange thought appears. Which one of these is actually me? It's an unsettling question, because if you don't know the answer, how could anyone else? Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. Our habit, simple words, but becoming yourself, is rarely simple. Before you can discover who you are, you usually have to notice who you've been pretending to be. And pretending is exhausting, far more exhausting than solitude has ever been. This is why silence begins to change. For most people, silence feels empty. But for intelligent people, silence eventually becomes honest. Avent's honest. The first few times you're alone, it feels uncomfortable. You instinctively reach for your phone, turn on music, open another video, anything, to avoid being alone with your own thoughts. But then, something unexpected happens. The silence stops feeling lonely. Instead, it starts asking questions. Questions you've been too busy to hear. Why do I always explain myself? Why do I feel guilty for protecting my own time? When did I start believing that being needed was the same as being loved? Those questions don't arrive to judge you. They arrive to wake you up, because the greatest prison isn't other people's expectations. Why? It's the belief that you must keep living up to them. There's an old story about an eagle raised among chickens. Its entire life, it scratched at the ground because every bird around it did the same. One day, it looked into the sky and saw another eagle soaring high above the mountains. Why? It asked. What is that? The chickens replied. That's an eagle, but don't worry about it. We could never live like that. So the eagle lowered its head and kept scratching the dirt. Most people hear that story and think it's about potential. It isn't. It's about identity. You can spend your entire life surrounded by people who unknowingly teach you to become smaller than you really are, not because they want to hurt you, but because they've never imagined another way to live. Intelligent people eventually notice something. The life they've been trying so hard to fit into may have been built for someone they no longer are. And once that realization takes root, every forced conversation feels a little heavier. Every fake smile lasts a little shorter. Every unnecessary obligation becomes harder to carry. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. Inside, it's alignment. Then comes the realization that changes everything. You stop asking, who accepts me? Instead, you begin asking, who allows me? To be completely honest, those are two very different questions. The first makes you chase approval. The second leads you toward peace, because real connection isn't built on constant agreement. It's built on the quiet confidence that you don't have to edit yourself to deserve a place in someone's life. And here's the irony. As your circle becomes smaller, your relationships often become deeper. Fewer conversations, more honesty, fewer expectations, more understanding, less noise, more presence. Suddenly, being alone no longer feels like losing people. People boast of fire, change, and vanishes. It feels like making space to finally hear your own life. But there's one final realization, one that almost every intelligent person reaches sooner or later. It doesn't just change the way you see relationships. It changes the way you see yourself, because the greatest disappearance was never from other people's lives. It was from your own, and coming back requires far more courage than walking away ever did. Maybe that's why intelligent people seem to disappear, not because they stop loving people, but because they finally stop abandoning themselves. From the outside, it looks like distance. Inside, it feels like coming home. The messages become fewer, the circle becomes smaller, the silence becomes longer. Yet for the first time in years, their mind is no longer at war with itself. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The people everyone believes are drifting away are often the ones finally moving toward a life that feels honest. So if you found yourself growing quieter lately, don't ask, why am I becoming so distant? Ask yourself something far more important. Am I leaving people behind, or am I finally leaving behind the version of myself that survived by pretending? Because those are two completely different journeys. One ends in loneliness. The other begins with freedom. And maybe that's why the people who seem to disappear are finally becoming visible to themselves. If this reflection stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever outgrown a version of your life that everyone else expected you to keep living? Leave your answer in the comments. Someone reading it might realize they're not walking this path alone. If you enjoy exploring the hidden patterns behind identity, relationships, and the human mind, subscribe to Quiet Power. There's always another conversation waiting for you here. Until next time, stay curious, protect your peace, and remember, not every disappearance is a loss. Sometimes, it's the quiet beginning of finally finding yourself.